The final bid was a number, $47,200. It was announced into the quiet of the courthouse annex room by a man in a sheriff's uniform whose voice was dry from overuse. He wasn't the auctioneer, not officially, but in Mason County, Sheriff Cutler ran the foreclosure sales. He had for 28 years. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit who had made the bid. The man gave a slight, satisfied nod. He represented the bank. Of course he did. He buttoned his jacket, a small gesture of finality. The room was mostly empty. 2 local real estate agents were there, not to bid, but to watch. A farmer who had lost his own place 3 years prior sat in the back, a habit he couldn't shake. The bank's lawyer, a young man named Davies, was already sliding his leather folio back into his briefcase. He had won. The property would revert to the bank's inventory. It was clean, procedural. He glanced at his watch. He had a lunch meeting in the city. The sheriff raised his gavel, a small block of dark-scarred wood. It had been his father's. Going once, his voice was flat. Going twice. The sound hung in the stale air, thick with the smell of old paper and weak coffee. A chair scraped against the linoleum floor. From the back of the room, a voice, quiet but clear. 47,250. The voice was not a man's. Sheriff Cutler stopped his hand mid-air. The gavel hovered. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the few faces until it landed on the source. A girl. She couldn't have been more than 15. She stood next to her father, a man who looked worn down to the bone, his hands clasped in front of him, as if in prayer or apology. The girl wore jeans and a plain blue shirt, clean but faded. She held a simple manila envelope in one hand. She was looking directly at the sheriff, her expression unreadable. Davies, the bank attorney, let out a short, incredulous laugh. He stopped packing his briefcase. He looked at the girl, then at her father, John Miller, a man he'd only ever spoken to on the phone. The smirk on his face was not unkind. It was simply dismissive. The kind of look a man gives a child who has wandered into a room meant for adults. A pause. The 2 agents exchanged a look. The old farmer leaned forward slightly. The room, which had been sinking into the quiet of a finished transaction, was suddenly awake, tense. Sheriff Cutler lowered the gavel and set it down on the folding table in front of him. He looked at the girl. His face, a map of long years in a hard county, gave nothing away. He didn't ask if she was serious. He didn't ask where the money was. He asked a different question. He spoke to her as if she were the only other person in the room. "What's your last name, child?" The girl's name was Sarah Miller. She had turned 15 2 months ago. She stood straight, her worn work boots planted firmly on the floor. Her father, John, stood a half step behind her, a silent shadow. His presence was one of support, but the authority in that moment belonged to his daughter. The room itself was a testament to reluctant duties. Pale green walls, fluorescent lights that hummed a low, constant note of institutional weariness. The chairs were cheap plastic, bolted together in rows. On the wall hung a calendar from a local insurance agent, still showing the month of May, though it was now late July. The air was still, heavy with the heat of a dry summer pressing in from outside. The bank attorney, Davies, stepped forward. He addressed the sheriff, but his eyes were on John Miller. "Sheriff, this is irregular. The bidder is a minor. She has no legal standing to enter into a contract." He spoke with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who explains rules for a living. He smiled, a brief professional flash of white. "We appreciate the sentiment, but the bank holds the winning bid. It's a matter of law." He was already turning away, a gesture meant to close the conversation. He was used to being the final word in rooms like this. He saw foreclosure as a simple, if unfortunate, part of a business cycle. It was paperwork, a transfer of assets. He had never considered the faces behind the account numbers. It wasn't his job. His job was to reclaim the bank's collateral efficiently and without complication. The Miller farm was just another file on his desk. 240 acres, a house in disrepair, 3 barns, and a delinquent loan of just over $47,000. An easy one. John Miller had not fought the proceedings. He hadn't hired a lawyer. He'd simply stopped making payments, then stopped answering the phone. An open and shut case. But Sarah did not look at Davies. She kept her eyes on Sheriff Cutler. "Miller," she said, "my name is Sarah Miller." Her voice did not waver. The sheriff nodded slowly. He looked down at the file on his table. The name matched. He knew John. He knew his father before him. In a county this small, names meant something. They were histories. He looked back at the girl. "And who are you bidding for, Sarah Miller?" Davies sighed audibly. "Sheriff, this is theater. Let's conclude the sale." But Cutler held up a hand, a quiet gesture that stopped the lawyer cold. The sheriff's authority in this room was older and more absolute than the bank's. He waited for the girl's answer. The manila envelope in her hand was worn at the edges. She held it with 2 hands now, as if it contained something fragile, a weight. The whole room seemed to be waiting, caught in the space between a routine procedure and something else entirely, something no one had prepared for. To understand why, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the Miller kitchen table. The foreclosure notice had arrived, the final one. The date of the auction was circled in red. John Miller sat with his head in his hands, the paper flat on the worn oak surface in front of him. The smell of coffee and defeat filled the small room. Sarah sat across from him, watching. She had watched him grow quieter and smaller over the past year as the letters from the bank kept coming. He had tried. He'd taken a second job driving a truck, worked 16-hour days, but a drought and 2 bad seasons had buried him. The debt was a hole he couldn't climb out of. He finally looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "It's over, Sarah. We have to be out by the end of the month." He said it like a man confessing a crime. He felt he had failed not just her, but a whole line of Millers who had worked this same land. The farm wasn't just a business. It was a promise his great-grandfather had made, and his grandfather had kept, and his own father had passed to him. He was the one who was breaking it. He said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up, walked over to a cluttered closet, and pulled out an old shoebox tied with twine. The box was full of papers. Old deeds, tax receipts, letters, the family history, written on brittle, yellowed paper. He set it on the table. He said, "I want you to see this, not because it can help us, but because you should know what we had." He untied the twine and began sorting through the documents. His hands, usually steady and capable, trembled slightly. He pulled out a thick folded document from 1958. It was the original deed, when his own grandfather, Thomas Miller, had bought the final parcel to complete the farm. It wasn't a bank deed. It was a private sale between Thomas and his neighbor. The text was typewritten, but there were handwritten notes in the margins. John ran his finger over one of them. "Your great-grandfather, he never trusted banks, not after the Depression. He saw what they did to his father. He swore he'd never owe a penny to one if he could help it." John unfolded the deed completely. He pointed to a small, dense paragraph near the bottom, just above the signatures. A clause. It was written in a careful, deliberate script with a fountain pen. Sarah leaned in to read it. The language was archaic, legalistic, but the intent was clear. It established a primary lien on the property in the name of the Miller Family Trust. This lien was for the original purchase price of $8,000. It stipulated that in the event of any future sale, forced or otherwise, The trust retained a right of first refusal and a right of redemption. The trust had to be made whole before any other creditor. Any subsequent loan or mortgage would be, by definition, a subordinate lien. John tapped the paper. He told me about this once when I was your age. He said it was an anchor, so the land could never be pulled away from us by a storm. I never understood it. I thought it was just him being old-fashioned. When I took out the loan for the new equipment, the bank's title search must have missed it, or they saw it and decided it was too old to matter. An unrecorded family trust from half a century ago. It was a ghost. John pushed the box away. It doesn't matter now. It's just paper. But Sarah didn't look away. She kept reading the clause. She saw the names. Thomas Miller, trustee, his wife, as successor, and then his eldest son, as successor after that. Her own grandfather. The trust was still alive. Dormant, but alive. A ghost. Waiting. The story of the trust began not in 1958, but in 1932. Thomas Miller was a boy of 10, but he remembered the auction. He remembered the banker in the crisp suit standing on the porch of his family's home, selling off their lives piece by piece. His father had argued, had shown them records of payments, but the bank had its own set of books. The farm was gone in under an hour. That memory became the bedrock of Thomas Miller's character. He grew into a quiet, hard-working man, a man who saved his money in coffee cans buried in the barn, not in a savings account. A man who paid for everything in cash. He was a man who collected patience. When he finally had enough money to buy his own farm, the one his family had lost a piece of and his neighbour now owned, he did not go to the bank. He went to the neighbour, a man he'd known his whole life, and made a deal. He paid most of it in cash, and for the final $8,000 he signed a private note, and he went to the county's only lawyer, a man almost as old as the courthouse itself, and had him draw up the deed. The lawyer had suggested the trust, a way to build a firewall around the land, a legal structure that would exist separate from any one person. Thomas liked that idea. The trust wouldn't be a person. It couldn't get sick or desperate or make a bad decision. It would just be. Its only purpose was to hold that primary claim, that anchor, as he called it. He paid the lawyer with 3 cured hams and a cord of firewood. The trust document and the lien were filed with the county clerk the next day, time-stamped and recorded in a heavy ledger book. For the next 50 years, Thomas Miller worked the farm. He paid off the note to his neighbour. He raised his son, taught him how to read the sky and the soil. He told his son, John's father, about the trust. He showed him the papers in the shoebox. "Don't ever forget this is here," he'd said. "This is our backstop. If everything else goes wrong, this is the thing that holds." But generations change. Thomas's son was a good man, but more trusting. He saw the world differently. He got a bank account. He took out a small loan for a new tractor in the 70s. The bank did a title search, but the clerk who did the work was young, and the records from the 50s were in the basement, in dusty, handwritten books. He found the main deed, but the addendum, the trust's lien, was filed separately. An easy thing to miss if you weren't looking for it. So the bank issued the loan. Then another. When John inherited the farm, he inherited the loans too. He consolidated them, took out another one for new irrigation equipment after the big drought of 2012. Each time, a new title search was done by a new company, each one copying the error of the one before it. The ghost of the Miller family trust was buried under layers of modern, digitized paperwork. It was forgotten by everyone, except the paper it was written on, sleeping in a shoebox. For John, the failure was not just financial. It was personal. It was a failure of memory. He had forgotten the story of his grandfather. He had forgotten the anchor. In his mind, he had let the storm come and rip the farm away, just as Thomas had always feared. When Sarah looked at the papers on the kitchen table,
She saw more than a legal loophole. She saw a story, a promise made by a man she'd never met to a son he loved, a promise that had been passed down and forgotten. Restoring it was not about saving the farm. It was about restoring the promise. It was about honoring the patience her great-grandfather had collected his whole life. Back in the auction room, the silence stretched. Sarah stood her ground. On behalf of the Miller Family Trust, established in 1958, she said, I am its designated agent. Her voice was steady, betraying no emotion. She stepped forward and placed a single, folded paper on the table in front of Sheriff Cutler. It was not the deed. It was a much simpler document, a single type page, yellowed with age, bearing the signature of her grandfather. It was the document naming him as successor trustee. Below it was another signature, more recent, in blue ink, her father's. And below that, a paragraph he had typed himself just last week, witnessed by a notary in the next town over, designating Sarah Miller as the acting agent for the trust in this specific matter. Davies, the lawyer, took a step closer to read it, peering over the sheriff's shoulder. He scoffed, but the sound was thinner this time, less confident. A family trust? That's meaningless. The debt is in John Miller's name. The foreclosure is against him, personally. The trust can't bid on his behalf to circumvent a creditor. He was reciting from a textbook. He was on solid legal ground, or so he thought. He was trained in modern finance, in the clear, unambiguous lines of corporate and personal liability. He saw the world as a series of contracts, and the most recent contract was king. The old piece of paper on the table was a relic, a piece of folksy legal nonsense. He looked to the sheriff, expecting him to agree, to dismiss this and get on with it. But Sheriff Cutler did not look at him. He was still looking at Sarah. "Is that all you have?" he asked her. She reached into the manila envelope again. She did not answer with words. She simply pulled out a second document. This one was a copy, a clean, white copy of the original lien, the one filed in 1958, showing a primary claim against the property on behalf of the trust. It had the county clerk's official stamp at the bottom, dated 2 weeks ago. Sarah had spent an entire day in the courthouse basement with the county clerk, an elderly woman who remembered Thomas Miller, searching through the old ledgers until they found it. Sarah placed the copy of the lien next to the trustee document. The two papers sat on the table, a quiet testament, a story in 2 acts. The room was now utterly still. The 2 real estate agents had put their phones away. The old farmer in the back was leaning so far forward he was nearly out of his seat. John Miller had not moved, but his hands were no longer clasped. They were hanging loose at his sides. He was watching his daughter. He was seeing his own father in her. He was seeing the quiet, stubborn patience of a Miller. Davies stared at the second document. He read it twice. He recognized the form of a lien, but the date, the terms, they made no sense. He shook his head, marshalling his arguments. This was his job. He was the expert in the room. He tried his first angle, the legal one. "Sheriff, even if this document is authentic, it's irrelevant. The bank's mortgage was secured against the property. Mr. Miller pledged the land as collateral. Any prior claims would have been settled or superseded when our loan was issued. That's standard practice." He was speaking clearly, professionally. He was trying to re-establish the familiar order of things. Sarah answered, her voice still quiet, still calm. "The trust's lien was never settled. It is a primary lien recorded in 1958. The bank's mortgage is a secondary lien. The foreclosure action only extinguishes claims that are subordinate to the bank's. It cannot extinguish a primary claim." She spoke the words as if she were reciting a lesson. The words were not her own. They were the words of the old lawyer she and her father had driven 3 hours to see the week before, a man who had clerked for the very judge who signed the original trust document. He had explained it to them slowly, patiently, over a cup of tea in his dusty office for a fee of $100.
He had told them exactly what the words meant and what they could do. Davies's face tightened. He was not used to being contradicted on points of law, especially not by a teenager in a faded shirt. He shifted to his second angle, the practical one. He softened his tone, trying to sound reasonable, helpful. Okay, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you're right. Let's say you win the auction. You still have to satisfy the bank's lien. The debt is $47,000. Your bid doesn't make that go away. Where is the trust going to get that kind of money? He was looking at John now, trying to appeal to his sense of shame, his obvious financial ruin. He was trying to expose this for what he thought it was, a desperate, poorly thought out stunt, a final, futile gesture of defiance. John Miller met his gaze, but said nothing. He simply looked at his daughter. Sarah didn't answer the lawyer's question. She didn't have to. The question was based on a false premise. She knew it, and the old lawyer had known it. She simply remained silent, letting the weight of the lawyer's own misunderstanding fill the room. The lawyer, getting no response, pushed harder, now with a note of exasperation in his voice. This is a waste of everyone's time. The bank will not be cheated out of its security by some ancient family document. This is an enforceable debt. He was making his third and final argument now, an appeal to pure institutional power. We will litigate this for years if we have to. The Miller family cannot afford that. Can you, John? It was a threat, plain and simple. He was telling them that even if they were right, the bank was bigger. The bank had more money, more lawyers, more time. The bank could crush them in the end. He stood back, crossing his arms. He had laid his cards on the table: law, logic, and force. He was sure he had won. Sheriff Cutler had been silent through the exchange. He had listened to the young lawyer's escalating arguments and the young girl's quiet, steady replies. He had watched the confidence drain from one and hold firm in the other. He was a man who believed in process. He believed in the records. He picked up the copy of the 1958 lien. He looked at the filing number in the corner. He turned to the clerk sitting at a small desk beside him. Mary, pull the ledger for 1958, volume C. The clerk, a woman who had worked in the courthouse for 40 years, nodded. She got up and walked to a tall steel filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer with a loud metallic groan and pulled out a massive leather-bound book. It was 1.5 feet tall and thick with a century of county business. The words County Recorder were embossed in faded gold on the cover. She heaved it onto the table in front of the sheriff, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. The room watched. This was the real authority. Not the arguments, not the threats, the book. It contained the raw, unchangeable facts of the county's history: deeds, liens, marriages, deaths. It held the truth. The sheriff opened the heavy cover. The pages were thick, almost like cardboard, and filled with elegant, looping, cursive script. The smell of old paper and dry ink filled the space around the table. He turned the pages slowly, his finger running down the index. He was looking for the name Miller. He found it. He turned to the page number listed, page 214. He licked his thumb and carefully separated the thick pages. The room was so quiet you could hear the whisper of the paper. He found the entry. It was all there, just as the girl's copy had shown. A lien in the amount of $8,000 granted by Thomas Miller to the Miller Family Trust, recorded on October 17th, 1958. Stamped, signed and sealed by the county clerk of the time, a man whose name was now on the side of the county high school. The sheriff read the entry, then read it again. He ran his finger along the handwritten lines as if confirming their reality through touch. He followed the entry across the page, looking for any subsequent notation, a release, a satisfaction, an extinguishment. There was nothing. The space next to the entry was blank, clean. The lien was still active. It had sat there, a silent legal fact, for more than 60 years, undisturbed, forgotten. Sheriff Cutler looked up. He did not look at Sarah or her father. He looked directly at Davies. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the book in front of him. The girl is correct. He said it as a simple statement of fact.
The Miller Trust holds the primary lien. Your bank's mortgage is subordinate. He paused, letting the words settle. Which means this foreclosure sale can proceed, but the winning bidder, whoever that is, takes the property subject to the trust's claim. A low murmur went through the room. Davies's face went pale. He understood now. He understood the trap he had walked into. If the bank won the auction, they would get the title to the farm. But that title would be encumbered by the senior lien. They would own a farm on which the Miller family trust had a claim that had to be paid first. A claim that, with modest, legally stipulated interest over 60 years, was now worth far more than the farm itself. Their own debt, the one they were foreclosing on, was now effectively worthless. They had been trying to seize an asset that had no clear value to them. They had been bidding to buy a debt to the very family they were trying to evict. The structure of the situation had been inverted.
The power in the room, which had resided so comfortably with the man in the charcoal suit, had shifted. It now sat in the quiet space around the 15-year-old girl and her worn manila envelope. Davies, the bank's attorney, saw it all in an instant. The weeks of paperwork, the court filings, the entire legal process, all of it had been aimed at a ghost. He had been fighting the wrong opponent. His confidence evaporated, replaced by a cold, professional dread. This was the kind of mistake that cost a man his partnership. He had failed in his due diligence, or rather, his firm's title company had. He looked at the girl, at Sarah, and saw for the first time not a child, but the calm, patient face of his own defeat. He had to salvage something. He forced a smile, a desperate, unpleasant thing. He turned to Sarah and her father. Perhaps we can be reasonable. There's no need to be adversarial. The bank is prepared to discuss a settlement. We can forgive Mr. Miller's entire debt in full.
Just release the trust's claim, and we can all walk away from this. Clean slate. He was offering them a deal. Forgive the $47,000 debt, which he now knew was largely uncollectible anyway, in exchange for them giving up the trust's powerful position. He was trying to turn a total loss into a managed one. He was trying to buy his way out of the trap. He was speaking to John, man to man, hoping to appeal to the shame and desperation he had seen in him earlier. But John Miller did not answer. He looked at his daughter. It was her decision. She had been the one to find the path. She would be the one to see it to its end. Sarah looked at the lawyer. She did not seem to be considering his offer. She seemed to be looking right through him. She understood what he was offering. A chance to be free of the debt, to walk away with nothing, but to owe nothing. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice, the choice a person would make if this was only about money. But it was never about the money. It was about the land. It was about the promise. It was about the anchor. She gave her answer, a single word. No. Davies stared at her, stunned. But why? Your father's debt would be gone. Because the bid stands, Sarah said. $47,250. She was not there to negotiate a release. She was there to execute her great-grandfather's plan, to use the anchor he had set in place. She was there to buy the farm. Not free and clear, but to buy the title, as clouded and encumbered as it was. A title no one else in the world would want. A title that was worthless to the bank.
a title she could get, but the price of a used car, the price she had just bid. The room held its breath. The machinery of the auction, so confidently controlled by the bank moments before, was now entirely in the hands of a girl who had just refused to be bought. Sheriff Cutler looked at Davies. The question hung in the air. Does the bank wish to raise its bid? The absurdity of the situation was absolute. Davies could bid again. He could bid 50,000, 100,000. But every dollar he bid was a dollar the bank would be paying for a property on which he could never hope to recover its money. He would be bidding against himself, buying a massive liability. He would be, in effect, paying the Miller family. He was trapped by a 60-year-old piece of paper and a 15-year-old girl. He looked at his phone, a useless black rectangle in his hand. He was supposed to text his boss, "Property secured." What could he possibly text now? He thought about the legal fees, the years of litigation he had threatened. It was a bluff, and the girl had not even flinched. She had called him on it without saying a word. The bank would never approve a costly, embarrassing lawsuit they were almost certain to lose, not over a small rural property and a $47,000 loan. The loss was already accounted for. His job had been to make it clean. He had failed. He looked at Sarah Miller one last time. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating. There was nothing but a calm, unnerving certainty. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The bank withdraws its bid." A quiet gasp came from one of the real estate agents. Sheriff Cutler picked up his gavel. He did not look at Sarah. He looked at the far wall, at the insurance company calendar, as he called out the final words. "Going once, going twice, sold." He brought the gavel down on the table. The sound was not a crack, but a soft, dull thud. The sound of something heavy finally coming to rest. To the Miller Family Trust for $47,250. There was no applause, no celebration. The transaction was as quiet as the girl who had commanded it. Sarah stepped forward to the clerk's desk. From her manila envelope, she pulled out the last piece of paper. It was a cashier's check, drawn from an account at a credit union in the next county. The account was in the name of the Miller Family Trust. The money had come from the sale of a small, unused parcel of land at the far edge of their property, a piece that was not part of the original farm and not subject to the trust's lien. Her father had sold it 2 weeks ago to a neighbor. It was just enough. Sarah handed the check to the clerk. She took her great-grandfather's documents from the sheriff's table, folded them carefully, and placed them back in the envelope. Her father walked up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it was everything. They turned without a word to anyone and walked out of the courthouse annex room, leaving the bank's lawyer standing alone in the humming silence. That evening, the air was cool and clear. A breeze moved through the tall grass in the fields. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the oak trees that lined the property. John Miller and his daughter Sarah walked the fence line at the western edge of the farm. It was the same fence his grandfather had built by hand, the posts silvered with age, but still strong. They walked without talking for a long time. The quiet was comfortable, earned. They were not walking on land that belonged to a bank. They were walking on their own land. The debt to the bank was gone, satisfied by the auction they had just won. The title was now with the trust. The anchor held. John stopped and rested his hand on top of a thick, gnarled cedar post. The wood was warm from the last of the day's sun. He looked out over the fields, toward the old farmhouse where he had grown up. He looked at his daughter, standing beside him, her face calm in the fading light. "Your great-grandfather," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "He always said
Some things are planted for the next man.
He wasn't just talking about trees.
Sarah nodded. She understood. She looked down at the manila envelope she still carried. It felt light in her hands now. A promise kept. The land was safe. The quiet was the victory. Some debts are financial. Others are written in memory. The Millers had finally paid both. But not every document that holds a family's future is found in an old shoebox. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight, on the back of a cancelled check from a dead man's wallet. And sometimes the institution that cashes it isn't a bank at all, but a town that has forgotten its own history. We'll see what holds.